I'm going to mute myself and turn my video off, and I'll watch. Let me know if you need anything, and tech is here if we need him.
All right. Oh, I have to disconnect the. Okay, let me go to participants and. Okay, I did it. Perfect.
Okay. So that's it.
Okay, you want to start, right, Maria?
No, I just want to say hello to everybody
Okay.
and then give you the phone. Come on, Mariana.
Okay, so I want to welcome everybody to this event, this conference, which is also, it means not only the very important point of the conference for WAPOR, which is also finishing, but also is the starting point for the WAPOR LATAM. So I want to welcome to all the members of WAPOR and WAPOR LATAM for this for this important event that we have today. I hope the conference is going very well. I forgot to say, I am Mariano Torcal, I'm the president of WAPOR LATAM. And the reason because I am speaking instead of the president of WAPOR is because we organized, theoretically, this conference was supposed to be in Salamanca. Unfortunately, given the circumstances, has been impossible for us to organize it in Salamanca. So Marita, which is the president of WAPOR, gave me the floor to try to introduce a little bit this event and a very distinguished scholar who's going to be the speaker for this important event. Just let me go directly to the point and saying that I want to introduce Noan Lupu. Is a associate professor of political science at the Vanderbilt University. He's also the associate director of the LAPOP comparative study in Latin America. As you know, all of you know, this is one of the two most important comparative surveys in the region. So also, he has an impressive curriculum. I met him years ago when he was actually a promising scholar. Now he's not a promising anymore. He's a real star. I want to emphasize 2 points that I know about his curriculum because I've been following his work. I think that there has been 2 major contributions, and so many, but one of I would say 2. First, I will say that he has a very famous book called Party Brands in Crisis, which has been published for Cambridge University Press in 2016. I think this book has been a very significant contribution in the literature and the discussion, introducing this in a very comparative setting, introducing this concept that has been very relevant in people who are working on many areas related with this, party systems, institutionalization of party systems, and also in voting behavior. The other element that I want to emphasize on his CV is his contribution, very important contribution on the topic of political polarization. He has very important contributions in this topic. And right now it comes to my head the very nice article that he has. I think I forgot actually I think it's party politics, but I might be wrong. That is on the study of 2015, the study of party polarization and mass partisanship. It's also in political behavior. Sorry, and it's yeah, I forgot about that, sorry. But also has another important contributions. It also has contribution in other areas too. It will be very difficult to mention all of them, but I also want to say that I really, really like his work on party system institutionalization. He's obviously an expert in Argentinian politics. He has actually most recent book is a compiled editing volume that actually is on Argentina, and it has been published in the University of Michigan Press in 2019. But also I like his work, and I know that because he actually contributed in a very nice chapter that in the book that I edited and in party system institutionalization, which is actually in Spanish. Unfortunately, we haven't actually never translated to English. So without any further ado, I really, really want to thank him for his, for accepting this invitation and being so nice with us to be here for us today. Just let me say something in Spanish because we have people for WAPOR LATAM. I will be very brief, and then I will give the floor to Noam Lupu. Bueno, quería dar la bienvenida a todos los miembros de WAPOR LATAM. Esta conferencia supone el final, en cierta medida, de la conferencia de WAPOR y el inicio de WAPOR LATAM. Pensábamos en invitar a alguien, tener el honor de invitar a alguien que realmente signifique mucho en la literatura comparada respecto a temas de opinión pública, sistema de partido, comportamiento electoral, alguien muy importante para la región, para los estudios de la región, y pensé que Noam Lupu podía ser un gran candidato y enseguida aceptó con una total colaboración y cordialidad. Simplemente quiero decir, y lo he dicho en inglés, pero quiero repetirlo rápidamente. Conozco a Noam Lupu desde hace tiempo, cuando era un académico con potencial proyección. Ahora ya es una mega estrella y una persona muy reconocida. Él es profesor asociado de la Universidad del Departamento de Ciencia Política de la Universidad de Vanderbilt, y además es también el director asociado a LAPOP, que está como todos sabéis, entre los dos estudios de encuesta comparada más importantes en la región. Lógicamente, su trabajo es un trabajo comparado, de una gran calidad, y como he mencionado antes, hay, digamos que, dos temas que particularmente destacan en su currículum, que son la idea de party brands, la idea de marcas de partido, ¿no? Y su contribución sobre esta discusión y sobre partnership ha sido un aspecto muy innovador y refreshing en una literatura que en cierta manera estaba, sobre todo desde el punto de vista comparado, estaba siendo ciertamente repetitiva, ¿no? Y luego también me gustaría destacar sus trabajos sobre polarización, ¿no? Antes he mencionado el trabajo de political behavior y algunos trabajos que son clásicos en la literatura. Además, y luego por último, ya sin extenderme más, me gustaría decir que yo conozco su trabajo también sobre un tema que yo he trabajado, que también es Party System Institutionalization, y bueno, conozco bien su trabajo en esa parte. Es un gran conocedor de la realidad argentina, y realmente en un libro que edité, que se llama Sistema de Partidos en Latinoamérica, bueno, tiene una contribución que considero que es muy interesante en ese libro. Pero bueno, hay contribuciones realmente importantes en diversas áreas y temas. Simplemente dar las gracias a todos por estar aquí. Recordaros a todos los miembros de WAPOR LATAM que después de este acto tenemos el Business Meeting, y es muy importante y me gustaría que todos estuvierais. Y ya sin extenderme más, pues me gustaría dar la palabra a Noam Lupu y que él presente el tema que va a tratar y que espero que disfruten todos. Muchas gracias.
Thanks, Mariano. That was a extremely generous introduction. Let me also just say thanks to both Mariano and Marita for the invitation to be here, and the other organizers of the conferences. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to have a chance to present some work to you and maybe suggest that we might slightly change how we think about public opinion. Mariano, I can't share my screen now for some reason.
Mariano, I think you need to make him a co-host because you are, I think, the only one host now. So if you make him Noam co-host, he will be able to share the slides.
Vení, por favor.
There you go.
There we
Try
go.
that. Got that?
Yes.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Renee. Okay. Let me start by saying that, I wanted to sort of take the opportunity to say a little bit about some research that I've been working on for the last few years. And this is work with Leonid Peysakin, who's at New York University in Abu Dhabi. But also in the context of maybe a slightly different or pushing us to maybe think a little bit differently about public opinion more generally. And I'm happy to take questions. We can wait until the end, or I have the chat window open. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat or to use the raise hand feature if you want to do that. I'm also happy to take questions in Spanish if people want to write them in Spanish. The slides will be bilingual. When we think about public opinion, we ought to think about where opinions come from. And of course, I think the sort of common way that we think about where opinions come from, we think that they come from people's perceptions, people's individual experiences, and also the evaluations, maybe a tally of evaluations as they sort of go through life, affect the kinds of opinions that they develop. Of course, all of that is sort of based and in some ways colored, maybe even biased by people's values and people's identities. As Mariano suggested, this is something that I've looked at with regard to partisan identities. And where do those values and identities come from? Well, we know from lots of literature in sociology in particular, but even some work on partisanship, that family socialization is a crucial part of developing, especially early on, those kinds of values and identities that inform later opinions. Of course, family socialization is parents transmitting their values and identities to their children, and those values and identities also come from parents' perceptions, experiences, and evaluations, right? So if we think about where opinions come from, I think we have to think about sort of a long-term process that spans generations. One of the things and the piece of this process that we're interested in this project is to focus on exposure to violence. Of course, exposure to violence is a hugely formative experience, especially, and we're focusing here on political violence. We know from lots of literature in psychology, of course, that violent trauma shapes people's psyches, their perceptions. Most relevant, I think, for our purposes, a kind of identification as a victim, a notion of victimhood as a result of suffering trauma. And we also know that negative experiences create resentment, and the need for attachments, those attachments to social groups, maybe to family, maybe to ethnic groups, and those things might result from being exposed to violence. And those attachments might be the kinds of things that get transmitted from parents to children, right? Those attachments, if we think of those attachments as being social identities, they can be transmitted from parents to children. So there's a kind of intergenerational transmission that we think would be going on when we focus even on the kinds of things that are affected by exposure to violence. So here's how we're kind of thinking schematically of sort of how these things work. We have kind of ancestors, or the individuals who suffer or victimized in some way by violence, again, focusing on political types of violence. And then at that's sort of our main independent variable. And the effects of that victimization across generations, focusing on descendants now, on their identities, attitudes, and even behaviors. And so the kind of model we have in mind is that victimization by these sort of ancestors, or we'll call them first generation, affect their identities. Those identities then get transmitted from parents to children, and those identities then inform the way people incorporate experiences and evaluations into their everyday public opinions and into their political behaviors. So this is the model that we sort of, the kind of causal model that we have in mind. What I will show you a little bit of today, not sort of a huge amount of empirics, but a little bit of a flavor of, is a more direct relationship that doesn't actually sort of break apart these sort of different components, but just shows the relationship between victimization of an ancestor and identities, attitudes, and behaviors of their descendants. And in the rest of our work, and we're in the process of finishing our book on this, we sort of actually trace the entire process. The other piece of this model that is important is the part here where victimization affects identities, and the context in which victimization occurs, how that affects the rest of the process. And so in particular, we focus on two things, or we argue that two things matter here. One is that violence, in order to have this effect, needs to lack legitimacy, or at least be perceived to lack legitimacy. So if people perceive that they were exposed to violence because they broke the law, or because they did something, they broke some norms, that doesn't have the same identity producing effects as violence that lacks that kind of legitimacy. And also it needs to be perceived that the blame for this violence is borne by an outgroup, right? Some external actor, as opposed to perhaps one's in-group being responsible for the violence, right? In order to have these kinds of identitarian effects that I've suggested. Okay, so studying this is hard, like most things, but especially I think there are sort of two main methodological challenges to doing this. One is, of course, that violence is targeted. And so if violence is targeted at certain types of people, as Mariano suggested, I do a lot of work on Argentina. So you might think that the descendants of the disappeared, or members of the family of the desaparecidos, might be affected by the exposure of their ancestors to different types of violence, or the absence of this person, right? But of course, if you were to find that those descendants of family members of desaparecidos are, let's say, more leftist, or identify more with the left, right, you might wonder whether the targeting of the violence, right, had sort of focused on people who identified with the left. And so we're not actually looking at the effect of the exposure to violence, but actually just a sort of normal transmission process among a population that was already had sort of certain types of identities and was targeted for violence, right? So there's an endogeneity concern. The other is that violence might be ongoing, or might be affecting multiple generations directly. That isn't a sort of theoretical issue, it's a sort of empirical problem. If we want to know what is the effect of the exposure to violence by an ancestor on a person, we need to make sure that that ancestor exposure to violence isn't correlated with, the person we're interested in, the descendants' exposure to violence as well, right? So especially with conflicts that are ongoing, or you could think of, if we wanted to see the intergenerational effect of slavery on African Americans in the United States, or something like that, right? So slavery is not ongoing, but other types of violence, which of course are correlated with whether or not your ancestors were slaves, is ongoing, violence and discrimination and the like. So we choose cases that allow us to address those methodological challenges. And I'll say more about a couple of them just to give you a couple of examples. But there are 4 in the book project. One is the Crimean Tatars in Crimea, formerly part of Ukraine until 2014, and now a part of Russia. And this is a violence that took place in the context of towards the end of World War II. We also look at the Ixil Maya in the highlands of Guatemala, a part of the Civil War in 79 to 82, mostly the early 1980s. We also look at a minority ethnic population in Cambodia, which suffered disproportionately during the regime of the Khmer Rouge in the late 1970s. And then also the ethnic majority population in Cambodia, focusing on the Northwest for a variety of reasons, the ethnic Khmer. So I'm going to say a little bit about the first 2 cases here and show you, again, a little bit of a flavor of the empirics. And then I won't say much about Cambodia, but I'm happy to answer questions if there are. Why do we pick these cases? There's sort of a variety of reasons, and a sort of practical one is that we needed to focus on populations that are settled compactly and where there isn't a lot of immigration, because as you'll see, we're going to interview the ancestors and the descendants, and we need them to be relatively nearby. We also need to make sure that descendants have no interaction with the perpetrators of the violence, right? That addressing one of the concerns, methodological concerns that I raised. So in the Crimean Tatar case, the descendants of the people who lived through the violence in the 1940s were born either right before or after the fall of the Soviet Union. So in fact, have had no interaction with the Soviet regime. We also need cases where we think the targeting of individual level violence is plausibly exogenous, right, addressing that endogeneity. And I'm happy to say more about this, sort of how we designed this, but we think that we have a pretty good handle on the targeting. And then finally, we need variation in context, the contextual variables that I mentioned. And context can vary either by case, the different types of contexts, countries that we're looking at different points in time, but also the types of violence that people are exposed to can be different kinds of context, right? So losing a family member might have a different, sort of generate a different sense of perception of legitimacy or blame. Being sort of the victim of torture or something like that is sort of would look very different. So let me tell you a little bit about these couple of cases that we focus on. One is the Crimean Tatars, as I've mentioned. This is a Sunni Muslim ethnic minority, currently living in Crimea, about 300,000 people, and historically have been living in Crimea for many centuries. When the Red Army retakes Crimea from Nazi Germany in May of 1944, Stalin orders that the entire Crimean Tatar population be rounded up and deported to Central Asia. The thinking seems to be, or sort of historians have suggested that because this is a Muslim minority group, that they were collaborating with either the Nazis, had been collaborating with the Nazis, or were collaborating with the Turks, and so had to be deported to Central Asia. So they're rounded up in the course of 2 days and put into cattle cars, trains. As you can see there in the picture, the journey to Central Asia, today Uzbekistan, takes roughly 4 weeks. Obviously not very good conditions. People arrive and are placed into concentration camps in sort of abandoned bunkers and things like that. Eventually, the population is allowed to sort of build homes and create more of what in the US context you might think of as a reservation. They have to get permission to leave, but it's more of a kind of community than a concentration camp. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the Crimean Tatars are allowed to return to Crimea, and in fact, almost all of them do return to Crimea in the early 1990s. So everybody is rounded up and put into consistent conditions. That's sort of an important part of the exogeneity here. And this includes, in fact, Crimean Tatar officers in the Red Army were also forced to go. Many people die from starvation, from infectious diseases in that sort of early period, either on the trains or in the concentration camps once they arrive. So not a sort of random distribution of exposure to this death of family members, but certainly one that's not politically targeted in any way. The other case that I will say a little bit about is the one of the Ixil Maya, which those of you from WAPOR Latin America, of course, are going to be more familiar with. The famous cases of genocide during the and trials around genocide from the Guatemalan Civil War focus on this period and this particular population. This is one of the subpopulations of Indigenous Maya in the highlands in Guatemala. Again, roughly the same size, about 300,000 people today. In this, so they're peasants, very poor, very agrarian population. In the late 1970s, the left-wing guerrillas move into this region thinking this is a sort of a constituency from which we can recruit people. There's also some kind of stereotypes about the Ixil in particular, based on sort of, colonial events where the Ixil are sort of considered rebellious is sort of a stereotype. And so the guerrillas actually thought that this would be sort of recruiting ground. In response to the guerrillas moving into this region, the army moves in the late 1970s and especially the early 1980s. And the perception of the army is that the entire Ixil population is supporting the guerrillas, and the army pursues what they call a scorched earth campaign, right? Everybody is considered a member of the guerrilla, and that includes women and children, of course. 70 to 90% of the villages are burned down by the army, and the loss of life is 5.5% of this population. That said, and this comes out in a lot of the anthropology literature on this population and on this conflict, and consistent with the field work that and the interviews that Leo and I did when we went there, the perception of responsibility is actually very ambiguous, right? So this is a civilian population caught between two combatant groups. And it's very clear to the Ixil that had the guerrillas not come to their area, the army would also not have come to their area. So exactly who is to blame is a little bit unclear. The army also pursues an effort of recruiting, coercing Ixil into what are called civil patrols, and quite a lot of the violence that goes on is perpetrated by Ixil members of the civil patrols headed by the army. So a much more ambiguous sort of relationship between victim and perpetrator, whereas in the Crimean Tatar case, it was very clear this is a sort of Russian effort to get rid of the Crimean Tatars. And so that's part of the contextual difference that we're trying to leverage. Okay, so we went and we did multi-generational surveys. The sample, and you know, I'm happy to say more about it, but we used a strategy that sort of gives us a representative sample of families with a living victim, right? And that's an important consideration, particularly in the Tatar case. In Crimea, we did this in 2014. In fact, it was shortly after, or we were about to go into the field when Russia invaded Crimea. And then the survey that we actually did was shortly after the annexation. And here we interview 3 generations within a family, right? So we find, we sample families with a living victim, typically in their 70s or 80s. We interview that person, then we interview 2 of their children, and then we interview, for each of them, we interview 2 of their children. So we have 3 generations there. In Guatemala, we did the survey in 2017, a more recent episode of violence, and so the living victims have children, but typically not grandchildren, or certainly not grandchildren who are over the age of 18 for us to interview. So we're looking at over 2 generations. And here what I'll show you is just the number of family members that that people lost, and this is as reported to us by the victims themselves, what we call the first generation. In some cases we asked, in some cases we didn't. The other generations, you know, what they thought had happened to their ancestor, but and I can say more about that. But here we're just looking at that. And as I said, there are other kinds of violence that people are exposed to as well, both personal and you know, family members being tortured, family members disappearing, various things like that, and you know, witnessing violence, witnessing massacres. All of that is sort of variation that we're looking at in the broader project. Here's a bit of sort of, you know, what we find, and there's lots of, you know, these are lengthy face-to-face surveys, and so there's lots of different measures of things. Most of these are kind of indices that we've put together from various items. But we have a very important part of our survey is measuring in-group attachment. And this is, in these cases, ethnic in-group attachment. So Crimean Tatars, grandchildren, right, 3rd generation Crimean Tatars, are quite a bit more likely to identify as Crimean Tatar, or sort of feel a sense of attachment to the Crimean Tatar ethnicity. The more their grandparent, the more family members their grandparent lost in the deportation. Right, so I should have said before, what we're sort of leveraging here is variation in the exposure to violence among this population where everybody was exposed to violence, right? It's not that we have sort of like a treatment and control group. We have a group in which everybody was exposed to violence, but some more than others, or different types than others. Similarly, or sort of the flip side, the descendants whose ancestor lost more family members were more hostile towards the outgroup on a variety of measures. And here the outgroup is ethnic Russians. We looked at ethnic Ukrainians too, and I can say a little bit about that. They're more likely to identify as victims, and they're more likely to perceive a threat from Russia, right? And we have a variety of ways of measuring that, but the likelihood that Russia might again do something to try to eradicate Crimean Tatars or something like that. We don't see any of this with the Ishil. None of this sort of in-group attachment, out-group hostility, or even victim identity, or at least the variation in victim identity is not explained by ancestors' exposure to violence. And then you can see this trickle down into more kind of contemporaneous, you know, what we might think of as public opinion. One thing that we measured and have not found anything statistically significant on, across the board actually, in sort of all the contexts, is an effect of ancestors' exposure to violence on religiosity or radicalization. There's quite a bit of literature on the issue of radicalization, particularly with Muslim ethnic groups, and there are members of the Crimean Tatar ethnic group who have become radicalized, and there are sort of Islamist groups there, and also among the Cham in Cambodia. But there's no relationship between that radicalization and sort of ancestor exposure to violence. There are effects on the kinds of holidays that people celebrate, especially sort of ethnic holidays, more likely to celebrate ethnic holidays in the Crimean Tatar case when the ancestor was exposed to more violence. Less support for the regime, for, in this case, Russia, and United Russia in particular, and quite a bit more trust in communal political institutions, ethnic organizations, communal leaders, political leaders. There's a kind of nationalist movement among the Crimean Tatars that has leaders, and people whose ancestors were more victimized are much more trusting in those individuals. Less civic participation and less political participation more generally. We also see the less political participation in the Ishil population, but in general, we don't see the same kinds of effects. I should say that it's not that there's nothing going on among the Ishil population, but the other types of violence where the blame attribution is more straightforward, we find these effects, just not with regard to death of family members. So with that, let me sort of conclude and kind of wrap up. Exposure to violence in some contexts, right? And you know, one of the things that we're trying to do with this book project is identify what kinds of contexts matter. But exposure to violence shapes identities, not just of victims, but also across generations. Those effects get transmitted across generations. And opinions and attitudes and the kinds of things that we all spend a lot of time measuring are shaped by those experiences of ancestors. They're not just shaped by people's own individual experiences and perceptions. You know, what are the implications of that? One is that, you know, for people who study political violence leaves lasting legacies. Oh, I think oh, there we go. In the Crimean Tatar case, this is 70 years later. An event that took place 70 years ago still shapes the way that people think about their place in the world, their attachment to social groups, and their politics. And in the other cases, sort of a shorter time frame, but still a lasting sort of legacy. I think this has implications also for, you know, how we think about the origins of identities and opinions. Many of us, of course, do survey research. And often when we do survey research, we treat individuals as kind of atomized, independent individuals. You know, some of us have worked on social networks, not sort of, you know, WhatsApp and Facebook social networks, but actual people's networks. And discussion networks, and in some cases, things like families. But this is probably an area that we have not paid enough attention to in thinking about how people form their opinions. And in particular, I think there hasn't been, certainly in political science, there has not been very much attention paid to the role of families. In fact, in political science, it's almost all sort of US and some work in Western Europe, and all entirely on partisan identities. There's sort of very little on the effects of families on other kinds of identities and other kinds of opinions. And so I think leave us urging us to think a little bit more about the sort of broader networks that people are in that affect the kinds of perceptions and public opinions that they form. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions or say more about anything that wasn't clear, that I sort of glossed over. Yes, Colin?
Yes, as regards the Ixil, the native South Americans, I'm wondering if their outgroup wouldn't be more Europeans in a general sense, as would First Nation native peoples in North America. So I'm just thinking that the violence that you used in your model was really a sort of very recent thing, whereas the aspect that would formulate their identity and their relationship with the other would be something more embracing, which would be more similar to the. So I wonder if you picked the wrong outgroup for your study.
Yeah, we have. I think in that particular survey, a couple of outgroups, but typically. The way that, at least in Guatemala, people refer to kind of the, in fact, they're not a majority, but they're the sort of politically powerful ethnic group is Ladinos, which is kind of, you know, sort of more European, whiter, but also somewhat, you know, mixed heritage. But they are sort of, you know, typically the presidents and political leaders, and certainly the generals during the conflict. So, you know, I think for us in this particular focus on violence, what we're trying to get at is kind of the effect of violence being perpetrated, and this of course was ethnic violence, that sort of violence that's being perpetrated by one ethnic group on another ethnic group, you would sort of, you know, you might think would kind of, or there's a lot of literature in fact on ethnic conflict suggesting that, you know, that the more violence that occurs across ethnic groups, the more hostility and sort of in-group identity and out-group hostility you get. So one of the things that we're trying to do is kind of problematize that, or suggest that, you know, that the context actually matters there, and people don't experience ethnic violence in a sort of black and white sort of way, that there's actually some gray areas. But, you know, it's true that there are lots of outgroups for the Ixil that, you know, they might think about. But in sort of looking at the variation across the violence that people were exposed to in this particular conflict, I think most outside of observers would think, well, you know, they probably blame the army and the types of people who sort of led the army. And in fact, you know, most people I sort of show this to are sort of surprised by I mean, there's sort of well documented that the army committed nearly 100% of the violence. But that's not how sort of the population itself kind of experienced it. I think that's sort of what we're trying to identify. There's a question also in the chat. I'd like to know what we can learn to apply to gender violence. Yeah, this is has been sort of something, of course, that we've thought about, and in, I'd say, most of these contexts, not so much the Crimean deportation, because in fact that context is one where the interaction between the perpetrators and the victims was actually quite minimal, because people are sort of, there's very few sort of Red Army soldiers kind of manning these trains and these concentration camps. But in these other contexts, and certainly in the Guatemalan context, a lot of sexual violence takes place. I think the literature on violence suggests that, and it's true of non-political violence as well. Sexual violence has very different kinds of psychological implications. Some are the same and some are very different. Victim identity in particular is a much trickier one in the context of gender violence. So I think you'd have to sort of think through the theoretical implications a little bit differently than we do, focusing just on sort of political violence, and I probably should have said non-sexual violence. And then empirically, it's very, very difficult to study sexual violence in these contexts. It's not the kind of thing that people are willing to respond to certainly not in kind of a formal survey setting, but even in kind of more qualitative interviews is very, very difficult to get any empirics on. But we do know, I think, from lots of qualitative accounts that sexual violence was rampant during the Ixil conflict. And I guess for our purposes, the sort of, one question might be sort of how correlated is it with the other kinds of things, and whether what we're capturing is sort of partly the effects of sexual violence, because that's kind of an omitted correlate. There's another question. I was thinking that the lasting effect may be caused by an emotional mark. Have you thought about which particular emotion is causing these lasting effects? Fear, hate, sadness, anger, humiliation, etc. So this is an interesting question. I think our expectations, or our sort of theoretical framework, is based primarily on sort of the psychology of trauma and the literature around that, which has also even looked a little bit at intergenerational transmission of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. And most of that actually focuses on the Holocaust and Vietnam. And then there's some work in psychology on childhood trauma, more of a domestic violence kind of thing. So that's kind of where we're basing it on, and I guess the sort of overriding emotion in the literature on trauma is anxiety, and so people develop a real anxiety about the trauma reoccurring, and that anxiety about the trauma reoccurring creates the kind of outgroup concern about the outgroup, and the sort of outgroup hostility, and the in-group attachment, right? The sort of retraction back into the in-group. So I guess I would say that the emotion that we focus on the most is anxiety, which is sort of related to fear here. But to be honest, that we should probably look a little bit more at the broader psychology literature on emotions and violence, and sort of think a little bit more about, maybe there are some reasons to think that things might be going in slightly differently. Does the effect diminish through generations, particularly in the case you can compare more than 2 generations? Yeah, so this is something we looked at, especially in the sort of, as you could guess, in the Crimean Tatar case, where we have 3 generations, and the effect does diminish over the course of generations. Now, the effect that diminishes is the effect that we can sort of gain traction on and measure, which is the differences within a population that was all victimized, and so that, as you might expect, because people marry other people, And unless the sort of people who were more exposed to violence are marrying people who were more exposed to violence, right? If there's some sort of mixing, then you would expect the sort of effects to dissipate over time. And that is what we observe there. So, the sort of, at some point, I think, so the way I think about this more broadly is that the sort of family component might dissipate over time if you have this kind of intermixing of people who were exposed to more or less or even no violence. But exactly sort of, what happens at the communal level is sort of outside of our empirical scope, and that could be sort of overriding, right? So the family effects become sort of dissipate over time, but the community level effects might remain constant or might even increase over time. I think that's a really interesting possibility that, we just, with the way that we've structured our study, our empirical strategy, we can't really get at. How do our hypotheses or theory travel in cases where the victimized group is not ethnically bounded, as in our case? For example, victims of human rights violations in authoritarian dictatorships, or in cases like African Americans in the U.S. Well, African Americans in the U.S. I think would be actually quite similar, in a sort of ethnically bounded group, sort of victimized by an ethnic, in this case, an ethnic majority group. So one way that we look at this is actually looking at the Cambodian case, which I didn't say a whole lot about, but with the ethnic Khmer. So this is the majority ethnic group, and the Khmer Rouge was headed by ethnic Khmer, Pol Pot, and everyone else in the leadership. You still see in those contexts the kind of victim identity that we get, and political identities. So the current prime minister of, Cambodia is not a democracy today, an authoritarian regime, but the authoritarian leader is referred to as the prime minister. And the prime minister is a former commander from the Khmer Rouge, even though the regime has kind of distanced itself from the violence that took place in the 1970s. And so we actually do see this kind of anti-regime political identity develop even among the ethnic Khmer. The ethnic identities are much stronger, for sure, and I think that's probably predictable. But you still get victim identities, and you still get sort of political identities along sort of salient cleavages like pro-regime, anti-regime in the Cambodian context. So I would expect something similar with sort of human rights violations in authoritarian regimes, and there is some work on some of that in Latin America and Chile. In particular, a number of people have been looking at the effects of repression in Chile during the dictatorship on kind of leftist political identity, right? So that's sort of consistent, I think, with what we're seeing in Cambodia. Any other questions?
Oh, well, if there is no any other question.
There is actually one more in the chat, Mariano. I don't know if we have time.
Fine. Yeah.
Okay. So how do conflicted values that might occur across generations get resolved? For example, values acquired through family versus those acquired from institutions, say schooling, or marching in public parades promoting institutional ideology, or I guess, sort of a national, which values prevail, family values or institutional values. This is a tough question, and certainly, I think, as I've suggested, our empirical strategy is sort of aimed at showing the effects of, or identifying the effects of, ancestor exposure to violence on descendants, rather than sort of the other way around. Where do people get their, what are the influences on people, and which of these features matters more, sort of family socialization versus community socialization, or school socialization, or religious leaders, or things like that. And here, I guess the one thing I would point to, and sort of a plug for some of my co-authors' work. So Leo wrote his dissertation and is sort of finishing this book manuscript on the long-term legacies of early socialization in the 19th century in Western Ukraine, and sort of looking at the border between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, and the effects that that sort of very early experience, and in particular the Austro-Hungarian effort to generate national identity, on contemporary, that is, in the last 10 years, attitudes. People who sort of lived on today Ukraine, and since 1917, between 1917 and 1990, the Soviet Union, who all lived under sort of the same regime for decades, and people who were born into independent Ukraine, still hold very different views if they live on the Austro-Hungarian, formerly Austro-Hungarian side of a river, than on the formerly Russian Empire side. And he looks at sort of, a variety of different things, but obviously the schools during the Soviet Union tried to socialize lots of Soviet identity, and socialize away religious identity, and those kinds of things. So there's lots of reason to think that what's happening there is families. Families are maintaining those identities across generations, even in sort of opposition to very strong national efforts to socialize alternative views. So, not a definitive answer, I think, but I think there is a large role for families.
Okay. I don't see any more questions, so I want to thank Professor Lupo for the very nice, very interesting and provocative talk, and also I want to also thank publicly everybody who helped to organize this conference, the members of WAPOR as well, the president Marita, Tatiana, and as well Rene. That I will receive mails from Rene all the time. It's had a hard time to organize all of this. Thank you, all of you. Y muchas gracias a todos por venir, por conectaros y por estar con todos nosotros conectados, y gracias al profesor Lupo por su participación. Ha sido unas jornadas difíciles para todos nosotros, pero bueno, nosotros continuamos con WAPOR LATAM, y lo único que me gustaría decir es que nos reunimos ahora para el business meeting in WAPOR LATAM. I don't know if you, Tatiana and Marita, want to say anything about all this? Want to say some words to all of this? Your microphone, Marita.
Sorry about that. Well, I want also to thank you all. Thank you, Mariano. We've been working very closely for all this conference, and we are very happy that we had this conference, even though in these hectic times and in a virtual, because we must continue working, we must continue making the voice of the people heard, and we all must stay together to do that each time better. So we continue with WAPOR LATAM, and for those who won't be there, thank you for coming to WAPOR 2. Bye-bye, and see you in the assembly.
Does anyone want to say anything? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.